that kids are just part of it. It's a primary one, but anyway. Welcome, I'm glad you're here this morning. We're going to continue on our journey through Genesis. Actually, we're kind of really coming to the end. We're in the last story. From here till the end of Genesis is really the story of Joseph. And I didn't plan on this, but it was interesting to me as we're praying for the senior pastor in this process and the waiting. I'll admit, I do not like the story of Joseph. I don't like it because it's about waiting. A big part of it. Joseph is given a dream when he is a child that does not come to fruition for over 30 years. Now, I'm not saying you have to wait for a new pastor for 30 years. That's not what I'm saying. But Joseph is one of those, it's a frustrating story for me at times. We're not going to look at the waiting today. We're going to take a little bit of a different look at it. Again, we've been on kind of this journey looking at it through a Hebrew reading of it, kind of a thing. And we're not going to be able to read the passage because we're going to cover from chapter 37 to 50. That's the whole story of Joseph. There's no way we can have time to read it all today. But we're going to dive into that. Before we do that, I want to take us on a journey down memory lane. How many of you ride a bicycle? Or have ridden a bicycle? Have learned how to ride a bicycle? All right? Remember back when we were learning how to ride a bicycle? How do you do that? Right? First you got the training wheels and you get on there and the bicycle stands up on its own. Well, I have this child that she decided she wanted to learn to ride the bicycle. I won't mention any names so that it doesn't embarrass Aaliyah. I did actually ask permission to share this story with you. But to learn to ride a bicycle, it's one of those, you take the training wheels off and, usually it's dad or somebody, the kid gets on and they start riding the bicycle. You got a hold of this seat and you kind of let them go. And then they fall over and what do we say to them? Get right back up. Let's go. Do it again. Let's do it again. Get back up. So Aaliyah, who is very persistent in her life. It's one of the things we love about her. She's very determined. She knows what she wants. She knows what she wants to do and what she's going to do. And she's on it. So she comes to me one day. She might have been 3. She was one of those, we're going to get this done right now. Normally it's 3, 4, 5, whatever. She's right on the front end. She comes to me one day and she goes, Dad, I want to learn to ride my bicycle, take the training wheels off and teach me how to ride this bicycle. It's like, okay. So we take the training wheels off and we're on the side of the house and she gets on the bicycle and I put my hand on the back and she looks at me and says, don't you let go. Okay, I won't. How are you going to learn how to ride the bicycle if I don't let go? So I just lied to my kid. All right. So we're going along, and she's doing really well, and I kind of let her go, and she goes straight, right off the sidewalk into the grass. Nice soft landing, stops, bicycle falls over. She looks back at me, and she goes, you let go. I'm done. You're not going to teach me how to ride a bicycle. I did lie to her, I guess it's fair. She was done for that day. We came outside the next morning, and we're just puttering around the backyard. And she comes up to me and she looks at me. She says, Dad, I'm going to learn to ride my bicycle. And you're not going to teach me. You're not going to touch it. Leave me alone. I'm going to go ride my bicycle. I'm going to go learn to ride this bicycle. Okay. Well, it's this determined, small little adult kind of a thing. 5 minutes later, she comes zipping around the corner on that bicycle, turns a corner, whips it back around. Rode that bicycle like that from then on. She's a very determined child, and she taught herself to ride that bicycle. And I didn't get to see her. She was around the corner. I'm sure you get on, you ride, falls over, get up and you do it again, and you keep doing it again, and you keep doing it again, and you keep doing it again until you get it right, kind of a thing. And as we look at these stories with Joseph, one of the rabbi teachers that I've been listening to, he says, we see this pattern in these stories of Joseph. And he says, I think these patterns are trying to show us something. And what it's trying to show us is do it again. Keep going. Just get up, do it again until we get it right. And once you get it right, things go smoothly. So let's look at these stories really quick. Starting in chapter 37, we see the story of Joseph kind of begin. The story of Joseph begins with, obviously, his birth comes along. He's one of Isaac's favorite, not Isaac, one of Jacob's favorites, not one of, he is Jacob's favorite. We hear the story of the coat of many colors, and actually in Hebrew, it's not a coat of many colors, it's a striped coat, the actual term is striped. The significance is not in the coloring, although there may be some significance because it may symbolize royalty, but it's that he got a second coat. All of the sons had coats, but in that culture, the Behor, or the one who is the oldest generally, who will then take on the role of the patriarch of the family, gets a double portion. So inheritance was taken, the family's wealth would be divided amongst all of the children plus one. So if I have 4 kids, I would divide my wealth by 5. Each one of them would get a portion, but the patriarch, or the next one to lead the family, would get 2 of that. And so the symbolism of that coat is just that Joseph got this, but he wasn't the oldest. Jacob was a little conniving still. Last week we looked at Jacob and kind of said there was some restoration, but he's still human. He kind of did some things wrong. And then Joseph gets this coat and he goes out to his brothers. Look what I got. As he's standing in the fields and his brothers are going, you're the little twerp. You're the youngest at this point. He was still the youngest. There is some other children that come along later, and dad gave you an extra coat. And then on top of it, Joseph begins to tell these stories about these dreams where everybody in the family will bow down to him. And his brothers get a little ticked off. And what do? They're ready to kill him. We're going to just kill him. Let's be done with it. But whether it's cooler heads that prevail, there is some indication in the story, if you pay attention, that Judah may have actually wanted to come. They throw him into a pit to kill him. Maybe that Judah may have wanted to sneak back out and get him out of the pit. We're not totally sure, but they wanted to kill him, kind of a thing. End up selling him off as a slave to Egypt, right? So we have that first story in chapter 37. Then we move on to chapter 38, and we have this story of Judah and Tamar. Now, Judah is one of the older brothers, and Tamar is his daughter-in-law. Judah has 3 sons. His 3 sons, I can't remember their names, Omar, Onan, and Shalal or something like that. But his oldest son is married to Tamar. His oldest son dies. Within that culture, if the oldest son dies without an heir, the next brother is supposed to take his older brother's wife so that the name will carry on, things like that. Onan does not want to do that. And so God says, well, if you're not going to live up to the responsibilities that you're supposed to live up to, then you're dead. Boom, he dies. Judah then says, well, if you wait, the little brother, who's really little still, will grow up and eventually will become a man, and he can take you as a wife. And Tamar doesn't totally wait for that to happen. She does some kind of trickery stuff, and actually ends up tricking Judah a little bit into sleeping with her. She poses as a prostitute. Why Judah on a trip decides to stop and visit a prostitute? Not really sure. Not probably the wisest idea in the world, right? All of Scripture is not something that we should always observe. It's not something that we should follow everything that they do. Not a good idea. Sometimes it's there to say, this is a stupid idea. Don't do this, right? And so we have in this story of Judah and Tamar this very kind of thing. And in this story, he goes and she tricks him, and he offers her a gift and says, I'll give you a goat if you will, do this deed with me. And she says, well, how will I know that you're going to do, that I'll get that goat from you if we do this deed? And he says, well, here, I'll give you my coat. And if you can hold on to that until I get you the goat, kind of a thing. And it's like, oh, okay. And then she goes back and reveals that this has happened. And Judah's standing there, let's just say embarrassed, because she's got his coat, kind of a thing. So we got Judah and Tamar. And then we move in from there into the next story is back to Joseph. And we find Joseph is in Egypt with Potiphar. He has been bought as a slave, has become the second in charge of Potiphar's full estate. But Potiphar's wife takes a keen eye to Joseph, who apparently was this handsome young man, and begins to try and make advances at him. And as she's doing this, one day she grabs a hold of his coat and he bolts, and she's left standing with his coat. And she makes this lie about he's trying to come on to me, and Potiphar throws him into jail, or throws him into at this point, it's actually referred to as jail. But when we actually go from there into the next story, what we see is Joseph begins to interpret some dreams. And these dreams, he's in jail with these two guys. He interprets dreams for them, and he says, hey, when you get out, will you remember me? Actually, one of them gets out. The other one dies. That's the interpretation of the dreams. The guy gets out. He's the cupbearer to the Pharaoh. He goes before Pharaoh's court and forgets about Joseph for a little while. Again, part of the waiting I'm going to skip over because I don't like waiting. He's in that jail for quite a while, waiting to be called out of the pit. And eventually, though, he does. Pharaoh's having these dreams. And so then the cupbearer remembers, oh yeah, I totally forgot. I met this guy in jail who knew how to interpret dreams. And so they call him before Pharaoh, and they put a coat on him. And he goes and he interprets dreams for Pharaoh. And he interprets Pharaoh's dreams and says, this is what's going to happen. Here's the future. Here's what's going to happen. There's going to be a famine. You need to store up. You need to do all this stuff. Pharaoh goes, wow, you are really wise to be able to interpret that. And Joseph goes, it's not me, man. I'm just telling you what God's telling me through your dream. And Pharaoh goes, but still. And he makes him in charge, the second in command of all of Egypt, as they begin to prepare for this. The rest of the stories from there, the remainder of Joseph's story is we then see the brothers in the midst of that famine come traipsing down to Egypt to get food. And who's a part of the family? Judah. And Judah comes down and they say, we need food, and will you come help us get this food? And Joseph says, you guys are spies, and sends them away, and they come back, and there's this fun exchange where they had no idea, and Joseph's kind of toying with them a little bit to some degree. And eventually he says, I think you have a brother, right? Yes, we have this brother. And Judah has to convince Jacob to let Benjamin, the younger brother, go, because Jacob's afraid to let Benjamin go. He already lost his favorite son, Joseph, and Benjamin was the next son of that loved wife, Rachel. And Judah says, I will take responsibility for him. On my life, I will make sure he comes back. They go through all this exchange. Joseph, again, he does have a little bit of his father in him, plays some tricks on him, accuses Benjamin of stealing. But eventually, it's revealed that this is their brother. And that what God had intended for, what they had intended for evil, God had turned into something good. And it was through those evil things and doing things differently each route that Joseph now has actually become the one who saves the family because he's now in charge. And so this is the story of Joseph. Big, broad overview kind of a thing, right? I encourage you, go back and read this. That's part of what we're doing in this series is we hope that is encouraging you to find the silver spoon that we hid in your Bible somewhere. We didn't steal it. It's just hidden in there. But get your Bible out and read through these stories. But as we're looking at these stories, there's some things, again, reading from a Hebrew context, from a Hebrew perspective, that we want to ask. One of the things is there anything odd or unusual that you notice in this story? Right? Why is the story of Judah and Tamar in the middle of this? If this is about Joseph, we start talking about Joseph, and all of a sudden there's this weird story about Joseph or Judah and Tamar. And from a Hebrew reading, we go, if there's something weird inserted in here, we probably better pay attention. And so they would very much pay attention to this. The other thing that we begin to look at is, are there repeated patterns, or do you hear familiar things, sounds? Goats and coats, coats and goats, right? In the story of the brothers actually selling Joseph off, they throw him in a pit, take the coat that he was given, they slaughter a goat, cover that coat in blood to convince their father that Joseph had died. So there's coats and goats in the selling of Joseph. There's coats and goats in the story of Judah and Tamar. There's coats, any more repeated pieces that we hear in this. We hear of coats quite often. We hear of goats in a number of these stories. There's another thing that we hear of things like pits, dreams. These happen in a repeated fashion, and we don't necessarily see it in the English translations. It's easier to see in the Hebrew, where you see these repeated patterns of these stories that include these elements of goats, coats, dreams, coats, and pits. The pit, when I said before that Potiphar throws Joseph in jail, in that story, that's what it's referred to. But when they go to call Joseph out of that place, the story refers to it as they went to call him out of the pit. The word changes in Hebrew to pit. And so we see these repeating patterns. And that's where it comes to looking at so if we see these repeating patterns, what are we seeing? What's going on? What are the parallels that we begin to see in this? Joseph, we see dreams and his coat and this kind of stuff. And in the first part of the story, when he's going out and doing this, I'm Joseph, look at me. You're going to bow down to me. I've had these dreams, and look at my coat, right? There's this pride that we see in Joseph. There's some other silly stuff. Jacob doesn't help the situation by showing favoritism, and there's lots of things that are kind of going wrong in that part of the story. But as we begin to look where dreams come back up again, later, where Joseph is in jail and the two inmates that are with him say, I'm having these dreams, and he begins to interpret those dreams, there's something that's different about the way in which Joseph interacts in those dreams. Before, it was Joseph talking about himself and how these dreams affected him. Now, these dreams weren't about him, but there's a different posture in these dreams, because when he interprets them, they begin to say, you are so great. And Joseph, this time, instead of being the prideful person that we see in his youth, all of a sudden, he's a very humble person, and he says, it wasn't me, it was God. And he comes before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, I hear that you can interpret dreams. And he says, no. I don't. God does. There's a humility that comes in the later stories that we begin to see. When we see these parallels and we hear when we see these things ringing, but we begin to look at what's in the story, we see there's a difference between the two. So what about this Judah and Tamar thing? Right? In the first story, Judah fails to take responsibility for what happened. He got caught doing something he shouldn't be doing. Tamar was doing stuff she shouldn't be doing. All this kind of stuff. It's kind of a mess. Even if we look at Judah's role in the sale of Joseph, again, they're wanting to kill him. He's ready to throw him out. Judah's not necessarily the nicest guy here. He's shirking on a lot of responsibility, not owning up to stuff. But in the later story, when we see them coming to Egypt and the family coming in the midst of that famine, Judah steps up. Not only does he step up and lead the family to come and get food and that kind of stuff from Egypt, but then when strife comes because Joseph's playing games with them and threatens the family and those kinds of things, Judah is one of the brothers that steps up and says, I will die for this family. Don't take my little brother. I'll die. I'll stay. Joseph keeps Reuben, who is actually the oldest. But we see Judah, there's a change in Judah. Judah's now saying, I will be responsible. I'll own up to what I need to own up to. I'll do the right thing the right way. There's a difference that we begin to see in these. And as we begin to read this, what is the difference? We see repeatedly these stories where, start with the sell of Joseph. There's some things that went wrong. God says, okay, try again. So we see him with Potiphar. And actually, even in Potiphar, he does some things right. He runs away. That's the value that we often pull from that story, how Joseph morally, he could have given in to that, but he chose to run away from the danger, run away from Potiphar's wife's temptations. But in that also, he doesn't do it for himself total. He does it more for himself than, it's not all right reasons, but it's better. He's making the moral choice, not giving in, and like Judah did with the prostitute on the street, kind of a thing. But he's doing it different this time with Potiphar. But it didn't quite work because he still ended up in jail. But then the third time he comes back, he's called before Pharaoh and he says, it's not me. That humility has completely shifted by the time he gets to stand in front of Pharaoh. And from a Hebrew context, as the Hebrew reader begins to read this, what they begin to see in these patterns is this is a group of people that try, and try. And they fail. But they get right back up and they try again. There isn't a turning away from God. There isn't a beating themselves up over how horrible and awful they are. There's man, I didn't do that right. I got to do this again. Let me try this again. How do I do this again? The bicycle fell over. What am I going to do now? Am I going to give up? Am I going to beat myself up over the shame of this guilt? Or am I going to get up and do it again? God is a God of the try, and try again. We've talked in our story, we looked at Abram, and one of the first things that we asked was, why did God choose Abram? And then change his name to Abraham, and then make him the father of many nations, that is to bless the world. One of the things about Abraham was he had grit. He wasn't caught up in the culture. He was willing to follow God no matter what. But one of the things that we saw in him is that he wouldn't be defined by his failure. He admitted his guilt. He said, I didn't do that right. But he got up and he tried again. And not only that, I think oftentimes as we look at that, that's a good thing for us to see in us, because I think in our humanity, we often will get ourselves caught up in shame. That when we fail and we do something wrong, we think that God is somehow the perfect God, and therefore now I'm not. And we beat ourselves up and we shuffle away. And in this, I think we see not only Abram's character, but the character of God. Does God want our perfection? No. Does God want to perfect us? Yes. And so often when we are going about this thing and we try and we don't do it right, we beat ourselves up and we begin to pull ourselves away from God. And that's us pulling away from God because God says, that's not the way you do that. Let's try it again. I love you. Let's try it again. Get up. Brush yourself off. Get back on the bicycle. Get back on the horse. Oh man, I just came with the whole story there. I had this horse growing up. Her name was Hey You. We didn't name the horse. And not only that, this horse was also it was actually a cart pony. It wasn't really a horse. She was trained to pull carts, and we would try and ride her. Her favorite thing to do when we would try and ride her is to just sit down. She'd literally just drop down. Horses don't lay down, but this one would. So you're standing over top of her. Anyway, crazy little horse. But when you're riding horses, what happens if you fall off? Get back on that horse. And I think God is a God that says that to us. Get back up. Don't define yourself in that failure. Don't beat yourself up over it. Yep, you're guilty. You done messed up. And there's consequences for our mess ups. Judah fathered his own grandchild. There's consequences, but God says, get up. Let's keep trying. Let's do it again. We'll get there. God is the God of try again. He's not the God of, if you don't make it, if you don't do it right this time, you're out. That's not God. He has standards we live up to, but he's there to walk us there, to be with us in the midst of that and push us towards that. You hold on for a little bit, let us go. God's the God of try again. What's the emperor penguin in the movie Penguins? It's not about, it's all about try with a great big oomph. Right? Sorry. Yeah, and Happy Feet, that's the one. The father's telling, he's supposed to be learning how to sing, and he's like, just do it. Try with a great big oomph. I think that's God to us. Just try. Get that oomph in there. Get that effort in there. You can do this. Again, I think God is, one of the things I really have enjoyed about this series is that too often, I think, in the Old Testament, we have over-focused on the God of wrath and justice. That's there. I am not denying that God is a God of justice and holiness. But we've missed in the midst of that the God that we see in the New Testament. We overemphasize with Jesus the love and mercy. But the God of the Old Testament is the same God. And he's there in love and mercy and says, get up, brush yourself off. Let's go again. Until we get it right, let's keep going. And I think we see that in the stories of Joseph. I like that a whole lot more than the waiting. I hope I'm not going to have to preach on that. Next week, we are going to kind of make a transition. We've now walked through Genesis. We'll kind of do an overview, kind of trying to tie the whole book up next week as we begin to look towards kickoff. And we do want you to be in prayer about kickoff. Life is about rhythms. If we were to continue reading through the Old Testament, we're going to head into Exodus and then Leviticus, and you hear a whole lot of things about 7 days, 7-day rest, Sabbath, 7 years, returning lands, and all this kind of stuff. We are a rhythmic people. God has designed us in our humanity to live in rhythm. And so we look at rhythms. What are those? And that's kind of why we're doing fall kickoff, is because it helps us figure out some of these rhythms. As everybody starts school, it's a natural rhythm kind of a thing. But again, fall kickoff isn't meant to be a gimmick. It's not there to just try and get people to come sit in a pew. In fact, I don't care if people come sit in a pew. I want people to know Jesus. I want people to connect to this God that says to them, I love you no matter what. Where are you going to hear that? In a pew. There's one place you're going to hear it. So I'm not saying don't, invite people for sure, but it's not about inviting them to be here for the sake of having numbers here. It really is about inviting people to be here to experience and to hear that message from God. And as we begin to make this transition, we're going to transition from Genesis, we're going to walk through one of the Gospels. So starting September 11th, that kickoff, we're going to start walking through the Gospel of John. If you want to get a head start, read ahead, all that kind of fun, wonderful stuff, you can do that. But I do encourage you in this time to be at prayer. Be in prayer for where God is already at work. One of the things Scripture says is that God is at work ahead of us and the kingdom is advancing before us. We don't have to do anything except for what God asks us to do. So we need to pray that we are attentive to God and what it is that God would ask of us to do, and where is He already at work and can participate in that. And so that's our prayer. That's what I want you guys to be praying about for the next couple of weeks. That's what we will be praying about. God, what would you have us to do? And to be listening for God. Be ready to give an answer. Evangelism is really simple. Don't overcomplicate it. You don't have to embarrass yourself and stand on the street corner and, preach hellfire and brimstone. When the opportunity comes, you're just going to get to share who you are and just share your story. This is the God that I've experienced. This is the God that I know. So pray for where God is at work, where He is moving. Listen for that. And then when the opportunity presents itself, just share your experience. I go to church because when I'm there, this happens in my life with God. It's that simple. So try. That's all we can do. I'm going to invite the worship team forward. We're going to sing one more song before we close. And again, God is the God. He's not out there to crush us. He's there to transform us. And so try with a great big oomph.